The Battle of Hue City during the American War in Vietnam started at the very beginning of the Tet Offensive on January 31st, 1968, 57 years ago this week. On this episode, a conversation with a man who was there, Nick Warr. He wrote an outstanding book on what he witnessed in the battle called Phase Line Green. I traveled to Vietnam in September, and Nick Warr was on that trip. We visited Hue City, as well as the location where Medal of Honor recipient Rodney Maxwell Davis was killed in action. This conversation took place on our last full day in Vietnam. My name is Josh Rowe, and this is Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. Yesterday was a fascinating day. I know probably emotionally hard for the family, but also I'm sure for someone like yourself who fought through a lot of these areas.
Yes.
How do you feel?
Yesterday's excursion to one of the battlefields that took place in the summer of 1967 was called Operation Swift. Those battles were huge and ferocious and just terrible. I had learned, I never met Rodney Davis when I was in the service, but I immediately, 2 months later, after he was killed, I arrived in country, and I began hearing stories about Sergeant Davis and Father Capodanno.
Father Vincent Capodanno, a Navy chaplain, was killed in action on September 4th, 1967. Sergeant Rodney Maxwell Davis was killed in action on September 6th, 1967. Both were killed during Operation Swift, and both were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor.
Those battles, those moments of terrible suffering on both sides were just hard to believe in many cases. So later on in life, I had the honor to meet Sergeant Davis's family in Macon, Georgia, and grew to really understand the story, and the respect I have for that man is simply without question. He did, I will share this small story about a conversation I had with his oldest brother, Gordon. I had been coming to Macon, Georgia for about 3 years at that point, 3 or 4 times a year to work on cleaning up Linwood Cemetery, which is where Rodney is buried. And I had gotten to know the family to some degree, but Gordon and I were standing close to the Sergeant Rodney Davis Memorial Monument as people were working, and we just started chatting about a variety of things. But in the middle of that, he paused and said, "I believe that Marine Corps training indoctrinated my brother to the point that he thought he was invincible. He thought he was Superman." As you all know, he threw his body on a hand grenade, lost his life in the process, saved 4 other Marines. So when Gordon said those words, it shocked me, first of all. And secondly, I felt that I had to tell him the truth. And the truth was, and what I told Gordon is, "Sir, your brother knew exactly what he was doing when he did what he did. This was not he knew what he was doing. Sergeant Davis knew what he was doing, and he was the one to act. And it allowed that company, Bravo 15, to continue the fight. And eventually, they persevered. They didn't kill all the enemy, but they were effective enough that the enemy units finally broke contact and continued off into the jungle, which brought an end to one of the worst battles fought during the Vietnam War. So how I felt coming on this, when John Hollis called me on the phone about 2 months before the trip took place and said, hey, we're going to Vietnam and we're going to honor Rodney, and would you like to comment? I said, absolutely. And so that was really, the best words I can tell you is it was a blessing in my life. Getting to know this family. They actually made me an honorary member of their family, which I'm very proud of. They're wonderful people. They live in Macon, Georgia, which is a tough place to be for African Americans, but they stand tall and they are accounted for. So I was absolutely thrilled to know that I would be going on this excursion, on this wonderful trip with the Davis family and with others. And even though it's difficult, but it's meaningful, and it brings joy to my life.
We've talked a lot about Rodney Davis, and as we should. But you mentioned Father Capodanno, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that story.
Again, I never met Father Capodanno. His tour in Vietnam was earlier than mine. I had the wonderful opportunity on a reunion in New York in 2000 to visit the family, and we actually planted a tree and posted a monument that told people about Vincent, or Capodanno, the Grunt Padre. I call him the Grunt Padre because that's what the Marines called him, almost everyone. And the reason for that is he was a battalion chaplain. Most battalion chaplains, if not all but one, would stay in the battalion's combat base, and there was usually a small chapel, and they had Sunday services, and that's what their job was. Father Capodanno didn't think that way. He felt like he needed to be in the field, on the battlefields, with his Marines. And not very many people know that a few months before he died, he was out in the bush with a rifle company where he earned a Bronze Star. His command, his superiors, kept telling him, Vincent, you do not go outside the wire. Your job is to stay with the chapel and take care that way. That's not what he believed. And so on the 6th of September, 1967, in the midst of what I think is one of the worst battles of the war, a young Marine is shot and wounded and goes down. A U.S. Navy corpsman rises and rushes to aid that Marine. Father Capodanno saw that and went to them in the middle of a hellacious firefight and stood high and shielded the corpsman and the young Marine. And all three of them were killed. So that story is a very profound and wonderful story of love. Love of fellow men. Love of Marines to Marines. And love of he and his sheep. He was truly a shepherd, and he was filled with love for our Marines. And he stood up in battle and lost his life. Again, the battle soon ended, and that was the end of the major fighting in Operation Swift.
I want to talk about you a little bit, because I think if I walked away from here and I didn't do that, I would regret it.
That's okay.
What did it feel like having these current serving Marine Corps officers talking to you as you walked through Way City a couple days ago? It struck me in a way that it was interesting to watch it, and so I can only imagine what it felt like. How did that feel, knowing that they studied your book, they've read your book, those kind of things?
It's always the best time of my life when I'm with Marines of any age. I like to talk to the young guys. I like to hear their stories. So yes, it's the best thing. You know, joining the Marines and doing everything you're supposed to do, that's not easy. It is very, very challenging, but they take you through a process where you get very physically fit and you're indoctrinated to the point where you should be ready to go onto a battlefield and do your job. But in reality, oftentimes, that doesn't happen. So I'm one of those who, when I got out of the Marine Corps in 1970, I took off my pack and I took off all my Marine Corps and moved on with my life. And for the better part of 25 years, I never thought about it. I never got in touch with anybody. And so there was that emptiness. And I had gone through some difficulty in my life. And I understood that I was afflicted with something called PTSD. Of course, I went to the Veterans Administration and I got help. And it takes a while for you to get through that, at least to the point where you can be civil and reasonable and not get in trouble, you know. So I think it was one of my, I've done perhaps 50 PMEs over the last 35 years. Those are professional military educational seminars where oftentimes the unit will invite a veteran to come and tell their stories. And when I found out about that, I just wanted to volunteer. Hey, you know, if you want me to come, all you got to do is pay my travel expenses. I'm there. Sometimes it's easy. I could drive to the Camp Pendleton. I lived in San Diego for 15 years. Sometimes not so easy. I got an invitation to go to Frankfurt, Germany, to speak to the Marine security guards in the Western Europe theater. That was a wonderful time. It was a wonderful time. Young people, probably 100 of them. And they all had bought a paperback copy of my book. And so that was wonderful. But I'm getting off track here, so I want to get back on track. Fine. What I was going to tell you during one of those visits, I was walking from point A to point B with a regimental executive officer who was a stud. And we were walking past the obstacle course, and I looked over at the lieutenant colonel. I said, "Hey, let's run the O course." He said, "Okay, Lieutenant, let's go." And I went, "I'm sorry, I'm just not quite physically fit enough these days to try to do something like that. So I'm not going to do something stupid like that." I had the opportunity on several occasions after 9/11 to visit my old outfit and other Marine units. It started in 2003 with Operation Iraqi Freedom, which was pretty good for us. We did very, very well. And so on one occasion, I spoke to a whole meeting room full of corporals and sergeants. This was OIF 2, so this is 2004, and these young men were getting ready to deploy. And I looked around the audience, which I always do. I want to see who's in the audience and what's going on. And I noticed there were 4 or 5 U.S. Navy corpsmen sitting by themselves back in a corner. And I looked at this sergeant and I said, Sergeant, why are your corpsmen sitting back there by themselves? He said, they're nothing but a bunch of squids. I went, okay. I didn't say anything else. I recognized I wasn't convinced this guy of anything. And a year later, as they came home, I was invited to come back. Same group. And I noticed that the U.S. Navy corpsmen were totally embedded, and there was a Marine on all sides of every corpsman. So they kind of learned the hard way, but sometimes that's how you got to do it. So, yeah, that was a wonderful experience. I got to go to Germany and Russia to do PMEs, and that was extraordinary. So I put myself out there. I've written books. People in the Marine Corps in particular and in the military often have read my book and studied my book because initially it was pushed out to the Corps, and it was everybody from staff sergeant and above needs to read this book. I got email messages from Iraq saying, "Sir, thank you for writing the book. You taught me, and I didn't have to learn a couple of lessons." And that was extraordinary. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that for a writer and a quasi-historian to learn that your lessons in your book were used in the battlefield and you saved lives. And there's nothing better than that for me.
When you speak or when someone does read your book, what do you hope at this point, after all these years later, that people take away from it? What do you hope people learn from that book?
I think it's 2 or 3 things. Number one, that Marine Corps doctrine and Marine Corps training are critical, and they really do help on the battlefield. If you really study and you learn, and I was very influenced at one point by a famous Marine general named Mad Dog Mattis. Okay, if he heard me saying that name, he'd probably punch me out because he really doesn't like it. But this is General Jim Mattis, who served as the first leader into Afghanistan. He was the leader. He took, as a 1-star general, he took them from the ships to their final destination, their goal. And then General Mattis was promoted to Major General and was the commander of the 1st Marine Division. And I saw him at reunions. And then later he was promoted to 3 stars. And one of the interesting stories about that is he liked to talk the truth. And this particular audience that he had, maybe 500 people in there, was a mixed group. There were military and there were civilians. And he did a great job. His speech was about an hour long, educating us on who we were fighting. What were these people like? What were their military members like? General Mattis, when he led any unit, he took his library with him. A lot of people don't know, but Jim Mattis's library is 6,000 books. And whenever he moved, that was part of his entourage, okay? So he truly believes in studying history. It is critically important to understand our history and world history to be able to, move forward. And he did an outstanding job. But at this particular conference, he's described all these bad guys, okay? I mean, and some of them are really bad guys from our point of view. And his last statement was, and folks, sometimes it's really fun to kill those bastards. The whole crowd went nuts, but a couple of the civilians complained. And they demoted him from 3 stars to 2 stars to punish him. 3 weeks later, they promoted him back to 3 stars. Okay, so he got the point, but he was still where he needed to be. Okay, he needed to be in command, and he was. He was a wonderful commander. And so the thing that I want people to learn from this is, more important than anything is study history. I mean, work on what you have to do, study the enemy, study what's in front of you, and so forth. But if you don't understand history, you're at a disadvantage. So, and it doesn't mean you have to read my book or any Marine book. It's history. And you learn so much from history that it helps you to function as a leader.
I heard you say while we were driving through the Citadel that this was your 4th time being here.
Yeah.
And you didn't think you'd get a chance to come back. If Wednesday was the last time you ever set foot at Lane Cove Village, Waste City, Citadel, what will you remember about our time there this week?
There's so many memories. I can remember, I remember the fighting, okay? I mean, that goes that's understandable. I remember those battles. I remember those long nights. I remember those days when I experienced loss. And one of the worst memories that I have as a leader was the night my contingent had to make a night movement. We very seldom did that unless we were like recon or, we were a normal infantry regiment, infantry battalion. So we had to move from point A to point B. I think it was like 5 kilometers to get to our goal. And my group was the battalion CP. It was the leadership because I was the H&S company commander, and my troop's job was to secure the colonel and the leaders. But what I saw many, many times was one Marine's love for his partner 10 meters away, and what those guys would do for each other. That was taught to us in boot camp and forever, all the way up as, you take care of your buddy. I have one memory that I think is just very telling about the Vietnamese people. I was in a truck convoy heading south from a further north place. I was riding in the cab, in the right seat in the cab. And I watch as I see this elderly Vietnamese lady. We called her a Mama San. And she had the stick and the big thing on the front and the big thing on the back, and she is just moving. And if you've ever seen this, you understand that there's a rhythm. Okay, these things that she's carrying are moving, and she's using that motion to move forward. Another Vietnamese gentleman close by saw her And as she was going by, he grabbed one of them and went like this. And this lady started spinning. And I'm thinking, man, that was really mean. But everybody in sight were laughing, okay? It was amazing, okay? So I learned that they have a great sense of humor.
A big thank you to Nick Warr for this conversation, and we'll have much more with Nick Warr coming soon on Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. This podcast is a production of News Channel 9, Fox Chattanooga, and Sinclair Broadcast Group Chattanooga. I hope you join me again real soon.